All right, Veritas 48 Symbolic responding to you in your video, The Presumption of Atheism, the Absence of Evidence. I had given several examples of when the absence of evidence may warrant or constitute the evidence of absence. Yes, I believe that's how the aphorism goes. Um, and you asked me to carry over those examples into the case of God, of the except based on the classic theological attributes of God, which are personal agent responsible for all creation, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and self-existent. Sort of a I realize this is there are other attributes attributed to God, but this sort of provides a sufficient set of attributes for the project at hand. All right, interesting. If we take the opposite of those, we end up with, not necessarily in this order, but it's curious to take the opposites because we get something that's temporal, spatial, and material, which actually describes the physical universe. Contingent in its existence. Now, in a sense, everything that is part of the universe is contingent upon the universe for its existence. I mean, to exist, it needs the space and time provided by the universe as a whole, or that constitute the universe as a whole. So, in a sense, those four attributes can be considered part of the physical universe. And this kind of, in a way, goes back to my example of a foundation for something. I mean, space and time being a foundation under which the entities in the universe exist. Um, but it's not a direct correlation. It's just an analog, I think. Uh, Other opposites: omni-ignorant and omni-impotent. Well, I guess a corpse would be omni-ignorant and omni-impotent. All weak, all ignorant. Ooh, frightening. Um, Impersonal agent. Impersonal agent. Well, I guess that would apply then. You could apply that to the physical universe. So we seem to have the actual personal agent aspects seem critical in the definition. You know, when you get to omnibenevolent, uh, omniscient, all-knowing, these cause a difference. Now, some people may think that the physical universe is conscious. I have no idea, man. But even I don't even I'm not even sure half the time if I'm conscious. I'm not as awake as I'd like to be either. You know, omnimalevolent. Well, there we get into the adversary. You know, there's the land of uh, sin. The landscape of sin. The landscape of sin. There's an interesting concept. Um, So if you could find something that met all these characteristics combined, then maybe we could go to the argument of the mutual exclusivity, something that if you could find the opposite of God, then you would say, well, God is not here, therefore there is no God. But see, then what we've done is we've assumed it's the opposite of God, so God must exist, and we're back in the round. I mean, one of my greatest frustrations is this duality of concepts: God, not God; space, spaceless; time, timeless. I'm constantly bouncing around between the dualities or the opposites, and it's very, how do we break free from that? Wittgenstein's book, I've mentioned this in other videos. He's got a book called Remarks on Color, where he talks about the impossibility for him of visualizing a transparent white, like a transparent white glass. Transparent blue, no problem. The image comes through clearly. Transparent green, no problem. Transparent white does not seem to be something our visual imagination can do. And it just shows me that at least our visual imagination really seems to be limited by nature. I mean, we can reassemble things that we've seen. To some extent, we can fabricate monsters and fantasy creatures, but our visual imaginations are very limited. It seem to be limited by nature, And when we're asked, when we try to challenge ourselves to imagine something beyond nature, beyond space, beyond time, the visual imagination just sort of fails. And now we have musical conceptions. Music, however, is based on tempo, which is a temporal thing, and space between notes. I guess that's time. Depth, maybe we get some sense of depth. But that's interesting how musical concepts maybe have some transcendent value. I fall back on conceptual, the conceptual imagination, we can come up with concepts that are even absurd, that transcend the laws of logic, and transcend reason, transcend logic. And we mix those with beauty and mix those with music, we get a very powerful form of poetry. And I think this is one of the beauties of the conceptual freedom. However, then we're in danger of stumbling across meaninglessness. So, meaning and non-meaning, there's another little dualistic pair. The foundation, I cannot imagination. I cannot imagine a foundation for God. So that my sort of example there sort of falls apart. Though you know, what my example kind of combined an idea of an environment. The dog in the room that needed oxygen. I agree with you that the dog, if I go there and I find a dead dog because there's no oxygen, the dog has simply changed state. But I think I mixed. I picked a sort of impoverished example or an inappropriate example because what I was describing with the dog is something that needed an environment in which to exist. Rather than a foundation upon which to exist. So now what, carrying that over to the idea of God, I don't know, would God need an environment to exist? The attribute says he's self-existent, so I suppose not. It's fascinating to contemplate, but I just cannot really answer it. Sorry. What would be the foundation of God? As I say, I don't know. Self-existent, self-foundational, we could add, I suppose. We might as well. I gave an example of when present evidence indicates a better explanation. Yeah, it's very interesting. I agree with you. It's difficult to work with. The concept of better kind of brings us to a value judgment, a comparator, a value judgment. So here we get into the concept of the best. If we take better to best or most excellent, so it's based on a concept of excellence, and most of our concepts of excellence are based either on the utility of an object, like this is an excellent pen, or or sometimes, I don't know, but Plato has a really interesting dialogue on this. What is fineness? What is excellent? It's very different to say this is an excellent pen than to say John is an excellent man, because then we're getting into virtues. I know Brain Outie has a really interesting video about God being excellence. But as I say, it's comparator. What can you compare God to? You know, I don't know. But again, I think all these things. Recognition, my example of recognition. Yeah, I know what John looks like. I walk in a room. I compare faces. I see that nobody looks like John, and I compare. Okay, the fact that nobody looks like John is evidence that John is absent. Of course, the analog here would be if we had an imprint of the image of God within us, either given to us at the time of creation, or inherited somehow, or derived by logic somehow, where we could actually recognize whether God was present or God was not present. And then we could say, okay, well, God's not here. Of course, the attribute of omnipresence would transcend that. So that's kind of interesting. Mutual exclusivity. If you could find everything, as I say, that was the exact opposite of all those attributes and perhaps others, then perhaps you could say God is not here. But as I say, we're back in the duality of bouncing between the duality of concepts. Even my concept of time is infused with my concept of space. And my concept of space really is infused with my concept of time. I mean, in terms of motion. So. What else did I have? Foundation, mutual exclusivity, recognition, excellence. I probably won't do a follow-up video on this Veritas, but it's been very interesting to contemplate these things, and I'll continue to contemplate them. As far as finding, on their surface, none of the attributes appear to be in conflict. I know how that maps out. There are a lot of arguments that find conflicts among these things, but I'm not really looking at these things as conflictual. I do find difficulties with the idea of a personal agent, because that seems to impose a limitation of some sort. And whether the deity or God is limited by being personal, or limited, what form does that take? Limited by being We don't say omnipersonal, right? Do we say omnipersonal or maybe transparent personal? Whether limited by the fact that God may be rational. I do see senses. I mean, benevolence is limitation, and if someone is not malevolent, So, you know, God is therefore something, is not a full plenum of infinitude, but does have certain boundaries of some sort. And a bounded God is an interesting God. Oh, this idea of excellence, the concept of excellence when it comes to finding something that is evidence of more excellent. This may be important in the comparison of gods. I mean, obviously there are gods that we no longer believe in, that people once believed in, that I think we've just simply outgrown. We've found a more excellent God or a more excellent conception of God to follow. Anyway, just some ideas. I apologize for my lack of rigor, but I'll keep contemplating these things. Bye bye. Thank you.